First of all, I definitely want to reiterate I'm really grateful to get to talk about this work with all of you and with the people who are looking engaging with this work. I wrote it alongside my co-author Elizabeth Dutro, and I know she can't join us today, but I'm also really grateful to be able to get to learn alongside her. She's been a really powerful writer and thinker with me on this. But I want to be clear that the reason we wrote this piece was from a couple of places of feeling stuck, and this article was essentially birthed in the days after the 2016 presidential election. If you listen to Joe's opening introduction, you can notice it's been a bit of time since the 2016 presidential election, and this article is fairly recent. So I want to recognize there's a big gap of time between when we first wrote this article and when it's slowly trickled out into places that people can publicly see it in ways that feel, I think, particularly limiting when we think about how academic writing tends to filter from and disseminated for the public to receive. I think there's some real challenges for us to think about around that. And I want to come back to that temporality piece in a second. But I kind of want to hit on four brief points around this. Maybe those will be fast, and I can hold myself to four since I've declared that as the number. So the first is that this piece started with teachers, and it started on the election night as I was watching the results come in, that both Elizabeth and myself were receiving text messages and phone calls and emails from friends in classrooms about what happens tomorrow now that it's increasingly likely and then became fact that Donald Trump became president. And the questions were particularly around, there's been rhetoric around a wall, there's been declarations of sexual assault made by the president on hidden camera. There'd been a lot of different kinds of harm that had been caused to the general public, right? And this wasn't about politics, but it's about, how do these messages coalesce into the lives of young people and into the lives of teachers in classrooms every day? And so recognizing this as a need that teachers had noted, that's kind of what got the ball rolling on. We want to recognize that there's been harm that's happened in our classrooms, and it happened as tied to politics. And that these feel hard because oftentimes teachers don't feel like they can talk about these things because there's a fear of reprisal, there's a fear of getting fired. And so those were like the key tensions around this. Because this started with teachers, this brings up the second main thing I want to talk about, and that is that we want to center whose knowledge counts when we write about things like healing and social emotional learning and buzzwords like grit and mindfulness that, people with PhDs pretend like we know something about. But what we really want to do with this article is emphasize that these feelings of hurt and uncertainty and needing to care for one another come out of the expertise that teachers and students already have. And so we want to center that, and maybe we can center that in the kinds of conversations that emerge from this, of how do we draw on what I know rather than having to cite someone and make sure that it's in the proper APA 6th edition format in order for it to count in a journal. This then brings up, so I wrote this with Elizabeth a couple of years ago, and it took a while to get through the slow machinations of peer review. It was rejected first. I should also just declare this. It was rejected from one journal that was a generalist journal. And so Elizabeth and I then changed every place where it said teacher and did a find replace and made it English teacher, and then put it in a journal for English educators. And so I want to kind of recognize the kinds of stumbling blocks that academics oftentimes face in terms of getting work into a general audience. I just want to acknowledge that piece. But because this was written a long time ago, my sense was by the time this finally comes out, this will be an article that is about a moment in time that we've passed. And we should use the 2016 election as a reminder of where we were, even though we've progressed, because we always progress in really powerful ways. And as we're talking today, I think that couldn't be further from the truth, right? I think we're in a place where, in the past couple of weeks, normative conversations around sexual assault, regular discussions around active efforts for voter suppression, declarations of an evil mob that's slowly encroaching on the United States from the South, right? Like these are regular things that we're talking about in ways that are fear-mongering potentially, in ways that are triggering if we want to use different kinds of terminology that make sense to our students. And so this wasn't the vision I had of like, we were in the past and we've progressed and we should just be mindful, right? I think we're in a place where we're particularly stuck, which is my last point of the four, and that is that we're stuck. We wrote this article saying we need to figure out how to heal as a profession, and Elizabeth and I offer some senses of how we can do that. We can bear witness to and make valid the kinds of voices of teachers and students in our classrooms and recognize them as valid forms of knowledge that oftentimes aren't counted in educational research. But in terms of what we do on the day-to-day to make sure that teachers are helping each other and our students heal, I don't think we have done a very good job in terms of the social emotional learning practices and professional development support. And we haven't prepared teachers for the expectation that this is part of their job, is healing for themselves, for their colleagues, and for their students. And so I'm hoping that as we think about this in the marginal syllabus process, a place for conversation about what do we do, right? What does it look like? What does it mean to be empathetic and act upon that empathy for one another? So I think I'm a little bit, I feel stuck. If not in the next few minutes, then over time through conversation around this piece, we can think about strategies for moving forward.